Many of us labour under the misconception that we can suffer for a good reason. We often only suffer in order to obtain greater pleasure later on. We work long hours so that we have a lot of money so we can go on holiday, for example. I know that I've lived that kind of life, and you know that you've lived that kind of life. But the thing that we collectively need to realise is that the greatest use of suffering is to build our character. We often hear all this bullshit about the mark of a man being his money, the mark of a man being what he controls materially in the world and the people he knows and things like that. And to a certain extent that is true. But what strikes a person when you first meet them and as time goes on is your virtue. I mean, if you go and look up the original Latin meaning of virtus, it means manliness. But that's not really representative of what it is, because it applies to women as well. It's how much we make manifest what it means to be a human being. A man of greater virtue is in a sense more human, more in line with the essence of what it is to be a man than somebody who isn't. So, therefore, when we practice virtue, we're becoming greater and greater men. And people notice this, and not only does it make it easier for us to interact with people, but it also makes us more sufficient as human beings to be successful within the world, and indeed when it comes to obtaining man's ultimate end. So, how do we go about developing these things as men and women? How do we use the suffering that I mentioned earlier to make ourselves better? Well, the key way to do this is that you need to understand vice. And vice is essentially the polar opposite. It makes you weak, it makes you effeminate, it makes you poor, and it makes you kind of despised in the eyes of people. I'm sure you can think of a ton of vices as well as a ton of virtues, but what unites them and what strategies should we use in order to get the most out of our lives and to reach that virtue quicker? So, human beings being one thing, have multiple virtues, and they're all linked inside of the person, and therefore all of the vices and all of the virtues are linked in a certain sense. So doing particular behaviours will improve particular vices but also affect the others. And I'm here to point out 3 vices that lead to all other vices. The first one is gluttony, which is a desire for food beyond what we're supposed to have, not just in quantity but in quality and the variety of food. It's actually not very well known, but you can actually be gluttonous without eating too much if you have too much of a variety of food. It leads to you eating for pleasure, which is not the point of food. And this also leads to sins of impurity, and it leads to any kind of sensuality. So if you don't want to be sensual, as man and woman are not supposed to be, then if you want to deal with that, deal with gluttony and all of the others will fall. For example, you're much less likely to be carnally tempted when you fast often and you eat a very frugal diet, so a diet where you're only eating perhaps 1 meal a day and it's the same meal over and over again. Because if you have that restriction of not only amount but also of variation, then you're going to stop desiring it, because over time you'll just kind of get used to it and be like, yeah. You know, a lot of us already have that with breakfast, where we eat the same breakfast over and over again and we don't really notice. But we should apply that to everything, so that we lose this desire for pleasure through food, and therefore control pleasures in other aspects. Another way that apparently works, according to Evagrius the Solitary, who was a 4th century monk, is apparently sleeping on the floor on vigils. Now, I haven't done that myself, but I can see why that would have a substantial effect on that kind of thing, and I can attest from personal experience that fasting does work when it comes to dealing with desires besides eating. The second one is avarice, or extreme greed, wanting material things and wanting lots and lots of money beyond what you should. You know, having money for the sake of it, becoming a miser, Ebenezer Scrooge kind of thing. Now, to deal with that, you have to practice giving people stuff. You have to practice charity, looking after people with your time, and feeding the poor and the disabled, as well as otherwise just being friendly and kind to people, but not the kind of nice, subservient kindness that you often see nowadays, that kind of impassioned, real kindness that comes from somebody with actual internal strength. One of the best ways to do this is to, in the middle of the night, go out and feed the homeless and poor children in your city. You know, just go out there with some food, stick it where they're sleeping, and they'll be taken care of. It's very important to make sure that people don't see you, so it makes it harder for you to self-aggrandize when you've done something. Because obviously people will praise you for that kind of thing, and that's what you don't want, because pride leads to falling even harder than these three principal vices. The third is actually related to what I just said, and that is wanting to please men inordinately. You should not want to please men, because men are imperfect. You should want to please God. Now, many of us suffer from this. I personally don't, so I'm just going to go off of what other people have said. And the best way to do this is to disassociate from the kinds of men who follow in virtuous lives, and then go and find people who are indeed good. Because then, you wanting to please them will lead you into virtue, and being more virtuous will lead you away from the desire. So you should go ahead and practice that. If you want more information on this kind of thing, I'd recommend, if you can, going on Amazon and picking up a book called the Philokalia Volume 1 and reading the writings of Evagrius the Solitary, because that's where I got a lot of this information, aside from my own personal experience of fasting and my own lack of experience at vigils and sleeping on the floor. So anyway, I hope you found this useful, and what I will say is that you will still feel temptations and things besides those three, but when you get rid of those three, they will start to fade in other places. Thanks a lot for watching. Thanks so much to all the new Renaissance Man subscribers, because we've grown massively over the last month or so. So many more people are enjoying audiobooks and controversial videos than were before. So I really hope those who are watching would consider signing up, because these people are clearly enjoying what they're getting. Thank you very much for watching.